Welcome. I think I want to start this conversation by talking about how I even began thinking about our topic for today, clearing, making room for Black healing. I joined the faculty at Lancaster Theological Seminary in 2015. I started for orientation probably in about August, and then September and October hit. And September and October of 2015 became known as times that were framed by the deaths of Michael Brown first, and then Eric Garner. Here I am, new faculty member, city girl, living in rural Pennsylvania, but in a town called Lancaster, at Lancaster Seminary. And it's my first few days, and the streets are on fire. The streets are burning. And not only are the streets burning, I have students who are spending their time studying and at the same time being stressed out because they have decided not to study as much because most of their time is now spent traveling, taking trains back and forth, or driving to local protests in the surrounding area. And when they would come back to class or try to focus on their work, I was always struck by how tired and how frustrated, and also how bewildered they were, trying to figure out how in the world am I going to make this seminary education matter in the middle of a moment where Black blood is yet again running through the streets. And so that was the beginning of my awareness that in addition to movement work that has to happen on the streets, there's also a movement that needs to happen within religious circles, within the church as it is my tradition, and also I would say within pastoral and practical theology as disciplines of discourse that talk about how we can reflect and then support the action of those who are socially engaged in terms of activists and organizers, but also clergy and laypersons of faith who take their faith very seriously as the motive for why they should be involved in social unrest. And that began the beginning. That was the beginning of my work around what does it take to make room. Some people may recognize the first part of the title, Clearing, Making Room for Black Healing, as a reference to Toni Morrison's work in Beloved. In Beloved, there are at least, maybe there's one written scene, but a lot of people have seen the movie, so it happens across 3 scenes in the movie, where there's a primary character and her name is Baby Suggs Holy. Now remember that Toni Morrison writes this book as a work of historical fiction. And she is essentially conjuring the image and the imagination of ancestors who were committed to not only fighting for their freedom, but also equally committed to their healing. Freedom and healing have been running parallel to one another ever since the first African enslaved were brought here to this country. Not only were they trying to get free, but they also took time to heal. And that healing was communal. And so here we have Toni Morrison depicting one of these healing moments through the character Baby Suggs Holy, who is a woman who had been emancipated. Her son had bought her freedom. She had made her home just on the other side of the Ohio River. And the home is there to catch those who are crossing railroads, dogs on their tracks, the entire nine, all of the narrative that we know about enslaved Africans running away from plantations. But what I love about what Morrison does is that not only she capture what it means to become free, but she also captures what it means to heal. So Baby Suggs Holy, just as her name implies, is the holy woman of the community. And she would often call the entire community out into what is called the clearing. And the clearing was a space that was at the end of a forest road. And I think she even writes it, she says that it's a space that had been at the end of a road that ended only God knows where, and who knows but God who cleared it, but there it was. And so she would call the entire community out there into what historians now call a hush arbor or brush arbor meeting, which was a space where they could worship the God that they knew in ways that were familiar, very far apart, away from the church experience that many enslaved Africans have been forced to endure under the whip and the lash of their owners. And so in the clearing, she calls them out and she says, "Come, let the children come." And the children come and they start to laugh. And then he says, "Let the men come." And she says to the men, "Let your wives see you dance." And they begin to dance. In a particular dance, they move into what is called a ring shout. And a ring shout is essentially this dance that is in a circular motion. And though you're moving forward, your feet never, one foot is always placed on the ground, creating sacred contact between body and ground. And then she calls for the women. And she says, "Let the women cry. Cry for the living and the dead. Let the women cry." And then it says that all of a sudden it got mixed up. Suddenly, the women started laughing, the children started crying, the men stopped dancing, and all, they ran in circles, moving in rhythm and time until they fall out. And then Baby Suggs Holy offers a beautiful sermon that I won't go into right now, which essentially says, "Love your flesh. Yonder, they do not love your flesh." So I'd seen the depiction of the movie version of The Beloved a few years prior to 2015. And for some reason, that healing space that Toni Morrison originally penned, but that was eventually brought to screen, kept showing up for me. And I kept thinking as I was working with my students, we need a clearing space. We need a clearing space for people to come and laugh and dance and cry and be rebodied against the difficulty that comes with fighting injustice, which is a disembodying experience. And so that really has been the foundation of my work around clearing space for activists and organizers to do the healing work that they need to do, even as they fight injustice in the streets on behalf of many of the communities and families and loved ones who bring them to this work. And so that is the foundation. I think I want to spend our time together really looking at 3 areas, and I'm going to share my screen and hope to God that this works out well. I started working on this project in 2015 at Lancaster Seminary. Along the way, I moved to Chicago, where I now teach at McCormick Theological Seminary. And during my visit, one of my interview visits, I walked into a cafe and there was the poster that you see in front of you. We affirm our existence. We affirm our right to not only live, but to thrive, to exist in a world where our humanity is seen and honored. We are organizing to realize a world in which our faiths are held in esteem, a fair chance to decide our fates. Black Lives Matter. And so I walk in and I think, this is it. This is the visual that captures the work that I'm committed to. Thus, clearing, making room for Black healing has to be about these things. This poster was actually created by a collective of artists here in Chicago during the height of, well, I don't really want to recognize a height. I think it's difficult to identify the height when things continue to move in a space of unrest. But I'll say during the earlier points of the movement that we call Black Lives Matter, which is actually part of a longer legacy of Black radical resistance. During that time, they created this poster as a statement about what it is that they are in the streets fighting about. But I take it also as a directive about what they need even as they fight. I read these statements about thriving, existing, organizing, a fair chance, and deciding one's fate as an invitation for pastoral care providers, spiritual workers, healers, mental health professionals, all hands on deck, anybody who is concerned about the interiority of Black life. I take it as a directive for us, as a coordinate in some ways, for us to understand that this is what they need, even as they fight for what they have yet. And what I think is most beautiful about this is that we have the opportunity to create space, to clear space, to make room for their healing that allows them to experience moments of this. Now, before I move into I have about 3 areas that I want to address. I do want us to think about, first of all, the historical background against which we approach this work of clearing and making room for Black healing. I also want to offer and bring to your awareness, the next slide does have some images that are disturbing. They do depict the violence that's committed against Black lives. So I want to let people know that before I share it on the screen, but I also share it not for shock value, but for us to understand that in order for us to do effective, comprehensive, and inclusive work with our African American activists and organizers and allies, we have to understand that this moment that we are in is part of a long-standing history of struggle with moments of triumph, but all along an ongoing effort for the liberation, emancipation, and wholeness of Black people. And so here is the slide. One of the things that I love about this slide is the woman in the upper left-hand corner, who obviously is facing police violence, and she is unbothered, completely unbothered, smoking a cigarette. I appreciate her very much as a way of thinking about how resistance is an external and an internal moment. So externally, clearly she's defying the police. Internally, she has decided that she shall not be moved from this moment. The clarity with which she faces the possibility of violence and death on behalf of those who look like her. The commitment, the sense of solid foundation within her is stunning and striking. And that sort of resolve persists, it reverberates, right? Through time. And I also see that same kind of resolve in this amazing picture that was taken probably in about 2017, 2018, during one of the protests. What I love about this picture, and I always wondered, has it been manipulated or something? But here is this contemporary Black woman showing the same kind of strength, the same kind of fullness and foundation. She actually, it's not very clear in that picture, but she's actually holding a bunch of sage, right? She's standing there and they're about to, it looks like they're attempting to take her into custody, but I'm not sure if it's the way that the camera is positioned, but it almost looks like they've run up on her, but have backed off, have fallen back as they've encountered something, some sort of force around her. I bring this image in front of us for us to recognize that the clarity, the foundation, the stillness that we exhibit and that we see in our activists and organizers is not just now, but it comes in a line. It has a legacy. It has an umbilical cord that stretches far back and will continue to stretch forward across time and space. I love that image because she got her strength from somewhere. She is not only standing on the shoulders of her ancestors, but also standing in the tide. It looks like, unfortunately, those police officers got caught in the backlash of the tide, my interpretation. To the bottom left-hand corner, however, there's an image that has far less possibility or opportunity for humor or a smile. But there's the grim reality of 3 Black men, could be boys, 3 Black males hanging from trees, 3 Black bodies hanging from trees, reminiscent of this Black woman who is standing here facing the police in the now, is aware of the history of lynching. There have been so many lynched African Americans. Who's to say that it may not have been someone in her family or in her community, but she is standing in the tide that includes hanging Black bodies. Resistance occurs as a step now that is anchored in a legacy that stretches backwards. The picture beside the 3 lynched Black males is a contemporary picture of an activist who's on the front lines now. Now, what I think is really important about that image, and I'm not quite sure if you can see the wording, but it says not only, it's from the Blackout Collective, which we'll see some more from them a little later on, but this is this image where they are inviting the community to come and support activists. And what I think is critical is that you see the strength, you see how alive this man is, this Black man is, as he's facing these police officers, some of whom may also be Black, which I think is pretty important. He's so alive and he's so committed and so grounded. And above that, there's writing, because this is from a Twitter account where they're inviting people to essentially participate in mutual aid support for our activists. right? I think that I have this here to demonstrate how Black bodies and Black body resistance occurs as a legacy or within a legacy. And I have this picture here because it's also pretty important for us to recognize the importance of supporting our Black activists and organizers. There's a plea for people to contribute money. Most people don't recognize that our Black activists and organizers, some of them are being paid for what they do. They're actually employed by nonprofit organizations, but many are not. And so I think that when we think about what it is to clear space, we need to clear some space, but that space has to be resourced for them. And this is a part of the legacy of what it is to provide space and care. Mutual aid societies in support of activist resistance has been going on for a long time. And again, everything has a past. It's important for us to recognize when we're trying to clear healing space is that that past offers more than pain. It also offers instruction and memory. The last image, which is awful, is the image of Emmett Till's maimed body. Now, oftentimes we see the images of his mother, Mamie Till, who is there in the corner. I'm unaware of who the man is. It may be his father, it may be a family member or a friend. But what we oftentimes see is the image of Emmett Till's body in the casket. But this is Mamie Till seeing her baby boy laid out after being dressed in preparation for the funeral. And it gives a sense of clarity, that picture, as well as the image of the Black boys who are hanging lynched. It gives a sense of clarity to the rage that we observe oftentimes when we are in the presence of our African-American activists and organizers. And I wanted to, and I put it here on this slide that talks about reverberations, trauma across time, for us to understand that what we are seeing when we prepare to create space and clear space for activists and organizers is old and new at the same time. The rage, the sadness, the despair, we have to understand that as a traumatic memory that becomes enfleshed and embodied every time there's a new incident of police brutality. And though there are moments where we can see the unbothered spirit of the woman up in the corner and the staunch, clear, repelling spirit of the woman who is more recent, we have to understand that that is a snapshot of their protest. The images across the bottom of hanging bodies, mutilated bodies, are what are grounding them in that moment. But just because they're grounded does not mean that they are not also in need and deserving of healing support. Trauma, just like resistance has a legacy, trauma too has a legacy. The field of epigenetics is a kind of an emerging conversation that really is examining in terms of somatics, how we actually hold memories in our DNA, it's in our flesh. The memories that we carry and that we walk around with are not just cognitive, they are not just stories, but they are active in the fibers of our being. And so it's important to recognize that when we are dealing with an activist or an organizer who has experienced a contemporary traumatic experience, it is likely touching an old trauma and oftentimes an unnamed trauma. There's no way for us to know, although some do, the traumas that our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, and community members, those are things that they experience. There's no way to know the details cognitively, but there is science that is showing that we do have an affective recall of that. And so when we think about supporting people who are dealing with trauma as they work on the front lines, it's pretty important for us to also recognize that we are also involved in healing trauma of the past as it now runs into, colludes with, compounds the contemporary experience of trauma. And I think it's pretty important to recognize that just because these folks are out here shouting on behalf of life, shouting on behalf of equity and love, it's also important to recognize that there is a vulnerability that exists within them. And so I want us to remember that when we're thinking about doing this kind of work with folks, that it has to be historically engaged. There is no effective healing that does not also engage the reason, the legacy, or as Christina Sharp would call it, the afterlife of enslavement, the afterlife of Jim and Jane Crow, the afterlife of civil rights, and the afterlife of the more recent deaths of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, and the list continues to roll on. More contemporarily, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. Right this minute, at this time of this recording, we are in kind of a holding space trying to figure out or listening to find out if the grand jury that was selected or to indict or to raise charges against the police officer who did shoot and kill Breonna Taylor will actually be indicted, as a indication of how real the legacy of trauma is, and how real the rage is, and how real the righteous indignation is. The city of Louisville, the police department, right now has shut down all time off for police officers. They're not allowing them to take any vacation days in anticipation of the unrest that will happen in Louisville. You have to understand, these people have been, these activists, organizers, and everyday folk have been protesting for over 100 days straight, begging for the law to do its job, to arrest the person who shot and killed a woman as she slept. And so we have to think about this historical moment with Breonna Taylor, preceded by an unbelievable amount of other historical experiences that are recently happened, but are part of the ongoing and unfolding history. We see it all the time. And through social media, there's no way that we can get away from the reality of the history. So then the pastoral care, the spiritual care, the healing work that we do, the clearing space that we create also has to be engaged in that history as it continues to unfold. I've talked about trauma, but it also has to be trauma informed, which means interpreting someone's behavior and their coping mechanisms as a response to trauma. Not that they were born this way or that there's something inherently dysfunctional, but to interpret what we would call maladaptive coping strategies as a response to a traumatic event. Trauma has a way of impacting the mind, the body, the spirit, and also relationships with others in a disruptive kind of way. And so when we think about trauma-informed work, it means that we also have to be mindful that physiologically, the person is responding to the stress of a traumatic event. But remember, trauma has a legacy that isn't always apparent right now. So there is the stress from the current traumatic event. That stress may also trigger recall of ancestral traumatic events. And so to be trauma informed, there's no way to do this work without having that kind of sensitivity. Otherwise, we run the risk, right, of blaming persons for their behaviors without taking into account the reason why they're developing those behaviors. We run the risk of pathologizing them. Additionally, even as I offer this, I think it's pretty important for us to recognize that the pastoral care that we offer and the spaces that we create must also be interrogative. It has to interrogate, not only understand and help folks interpret their coping strategies as they respond to trauma. It also has to be a space where activists and organizers can interrogate the historical narratives that they have received, not only about Black pain, but also about Black healing. Is it acceptable? Do we have time for that, right? What I've learned in my research with activists and organizers is that many of our Black activists and organizers are shouldering what I would call narratives of Black death, which essentially means that in order for Black folk to be free, Black folk may have to be willing to give up life. What I've done some work around looking at that, and I've come up with, is that it actually, I get how they come there. But the question is, are they also becoming self-sacrificing in their own self-care as a response to the white supremacist violence that is vented against them, right? And so the question is, how can we prepare them? How can we spiritually support them? How can we help them develop coping strategies that acknowledge they have to step up for the fight but that stepping up for the fight also has to be backed up with self-care practices that don't require that they sacrifice themselves and become martyrs in order for life to be. And so there's a way in which we have to create opportunities for them to really look at the narratives that have been formative for them as they establish their identities as activists and organizers. Is that narrative formed essentially around self-sacrifice? And are there ways in which the emancipatory impulse that compels them as this work can also compel them to care for themselves as much as they fight for themselves and others? So again, pastoral care, support work, healing work really needs to be historically engaged, trauma-informed, and interrogative. Now, when we think about those notions, I think it's pretty important for us to also take a look at what that looks like, right? How do we do that? How do we create spaces that are able to hold all of that and that are able to move in that way? I turn to the work of what I call Black cultural craftswomen. Here in this segment where I talk about having a fierce Black tenderness contra white supremacist context. To the left, or to my left, on the screen, you'll see Patrisse Khan-Cullors. More often, she is known for being one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. On the right, we have Tricia Hersey, the founder of the MAP Ministry. I'm going to start with Patrisse Khan-Cullors. While most of us know her for her work with Black Lives Matter, which continues to this day, fewer people know her also as an artist. She, in addition to doing direct action and organizing work, she is also engaged as art as activism. And one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my entire life, I have to say, is the way in which she used her master's project as an opportunity to showcase Black healing. So I'll start with her and then I'll return to Tricia Hersey. Here is an image from this beautiful communal healing space that she gathered. These images depict an afternoon in which she gathered Black folk for an opportunity to let go of what they've been carrying. Now, I was raised in the Baptist church. I'm ordained in the United Church of Christ, but I was raised in the Baptist church. And when I saw this image at the bottom of these Black bodies that are sitting pensively still in these white robes, it reminded me of baptism. That's where it took me. But I wonder if there's a way in which we can start to think about the cleansing rituals of the church and how they can be a supportive frame of reference for the cleansing that Black activists need to do after being on the front lines day after day, week after week, and also carrying ancestral legacies of resistance and the need for healing within that resistance. And so here Patrisse Khan-Cullors shows up. She is in a bath. I think that is a bathtub, a cast iron clawfoot tub filled with sugar, I think. She's in a bath full of sugar. The picture on the left is what all of the participants went through, which is a ceremonial washing of their hair. And what I love about this is that this image was captured in public. The exhibit was a public display. My interpretation of it is it's a public display of the ritualizing, the fierce tenderness that allows Black activists to be whole while they go in and out of spaces that are dead bent on disintegrating them, making them unwhole. And so each one of these persons stepped up and allowed someone to wash their hair. And I think that that's so beautiful also because the whole notion of washing and letting go, but also that it's a public declaration that says that healing is necessary, right? And that it's not a privatized thing. It's not just for these people, but that there needs to be a collective communal healing, a collective communal washing away of the difficulty of what it takes to step up day after day on behalf of Black life. I'm going to reference Toni Morrison again. In that same book, Beloved, she also talks about, she says to the woman, Setha, who is the primary character in the story, who is struggling over her decisions she has made as a free woman. And in a healing moment between Baby Suds Holy and Setha, she says to her, lay it down, sword and shield, lay it down. And I've always remembered this because I'm thinking about in light of this public space that Patrice Kahn Colors has created for people to wash one another's hair. They are laying down the sword of defense and laying down the shield to reveal their vulnerability. And that's part of what has to be a space when we create clearing space for African American activists to do healing work. We have got to create spaces that make it safe enough for them to lay down sword and shield, to not have to fight against us as practitioners, meaning we must do our own self-work around the ideas we've internalized around who Black activists are, their strength, their capacities, they're so strong, do they need healing? And conversely, when we encounter that strength, there are moments where we may become intimidated. And so our response may be to try to figure out how we can dismantle or force them to kind of take off those shields. That's not what this work is about. She, Patrice Kahn Colors, offered a space and invited people. And likewise, we have to offer a space and invite people at their own choosing and in their own ways to lay down sword and shield. Part of it is that they also are recognizing that just as much as Black folks are recovering from white supremacy, so too are we healers recovering from white supremacy and white supremacy's cousins, which are racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, heteronormativity, ageism, and ableism, all of the isms. Just as much as they know that they are fighting those isms, they also are aware that we as healers are also recovering. So it is important for us to do our own work so that they can know safe space, be able to see and sense that they can lay down sword and shield in the ways that Patrice Kahn Colors has created space for people to do that in a public way, healing on display, which I think also disrupts this entire narrative that we have to be strong all the time, that we can't cry, that we can't be seen for our needs. And so that's why I love what she is doing here as an offering. Art as activism as an offering, and for us instructive of what it actually looks like to create healing, clearing space that is historically engaged, trauma-informed, and interrogative. So this slide is from the work of Tricia Hersey and the NAP Ministry. I love these quotes here that are often found on Instagram. Rest is a form of resistance because it disrupts and pushes back against capitalism and white supremacy. Signed, the NAP Ministry. And also, naps help you wake up. In the same way that Patrice Kahn Colors has created public space for Black resistance through healing, so too does Tricia Hersey. This image is of a space that's been prepared to receive people to nap collectively in public. And I think that this is critical because it definitely pushes against what they're identifying here against capitalism, but it also says that we have to actually have some sleep. We all need it, right? Psychologically, sleep is where your body actually regenerates itself. Dream states are also where your mind works through a lot of what are the many things that it couldn't quite get a grip on while you're awake. This is the space where psychologically we kind of reconcile those things, or we also fight it out. But creating a space where people can come and rest. And I think it's pretty important to also recognize that Tricia Hersey is also a yoga teacher and instructor. She offers a space that is a particular kind of yoga known as restorative yoga or yoga yin yoga, where the bodies are supported with pillows and blankets and bolsters. Most people don't realize that when you lay down in the bed, you may be comfortable, but you actually aren't fully supported. And so what happens in this particular kind of restorative practice, the instructor will walk around to each person and place blankets under parts of the body that we normally don't recognize are not supported, but actually are just suspended in air. And so when you put a blanket there or a bolster or a pillow, you really feel the support so the body is able to actually let go. And just think about that. How many activists and organizers have been on front lines, have been organizing, oftentimes without all of their needs being met in terms of financially, and also education, insurance, things like that. What does it mean to open up a space where their bodies receive the support that they need to actually enter a space of rest? What does it mean to decide not to push this day, but in order to be ready for the push tomorrow, I have to rest today? What does it mean also for us to create spaces where people can nap, where people can restore, where people can wash and release? What does it mean for them also to embody that kind of ease as a form of resistance? Think about it. Oppression in all of its forms sets us on edge because it essentially says you have no place, you have no right to be here. And so what does it mean to reclaim the body and claim public space, shared space, to collectively declare, I am here, I am unafraid, and I'm going to take what I need in order to be at ease in this space because I'm a human being just like everyone else. And I deserve air, I deserve time, I deserve space. We all deserve air, time, and space to collect ourselves. And so I love this work. It also interrupts some important mythology that runs in American culture, but I'm going to be specific to African American activists and organizers that you have to stay on the grind. You got to stay in it. You have to stay plugged in. Many of our millennial and younger activists have watched their elders and ancestors, though they may have triumphed in terms of the law and progress, have watched the toll it took on their minds and their bodies and their relationships and their hearts, and decided there's got to be a different way to do this. And so part of our work is to create spaces where they can try on this kind of restoration. And so here I want to point out that the work has got to be restorative, intermittent, and clear. Finally, one of the key pieces in doing work that I found with activists and organizers is to recognize that not only is their work ancestral, so too must our healing strategies also have be rooted in legacies of transatlantic experience. Here up in the top corner, we see images from Nigeria in 1929. The women had taken to the streets to protest against how war had been ravaging their communities, bearing the breasts that have nurtured generations. Here at the bottom, members of the Blackout Collective from San Francisco in 2015 take up the same strategy to honor the women from Nigeria by bringing over that strategy of bearing one's breast in the street to raise awareness, but also to protest against the violence that has been committed against these kinds of bodies, these Black female identified bodies. And here they are in terms of showing up for the Say Her Name work. Say the names of the women. Say the names of the women identified persons. The Blackout Collective has been very vocal in its work around raising awareness and also advocacy and action on behalf of women identified Black victims of violence. This is critical because it exemplifies how their work is inclusive, and just like I talked about, their work has to be clear, so too must our work be inclusive in terms of the practices and the spiritual perspectives that inform our work. The important piece is that we have got to understand that within the movement for Black life, we have people who are from all stripes of faith, our major world religions, our indigenous practices, traditional African religion, some that are identifying themselves as spiritual but non-religious, some who identify themselves as humanists. But it's important for us to understand that the religious landscape that sits behind us and that we offer as a clearing space has to be non-monolithic. We have to be able to go the distance and partner with those who can create opportunity and space that holds the energy that will help them heal, which means that the space may be offer some Christian language or artifacts, Buddhist, Islam, Jewish, African traditional religion, and to not be thrown off if they identify themselves as an amalgam of those multiple experiences. So making room within ourselves to understand that the religious landscape that sits, or the spiritual landscape that sits in the background of a lot of our activists and organizers is full, it's rich. The best thing we can do is to become curious about how that landscape helps them make meaning and serves as a useful, helpful, life affirming resource for them as they do this work. The next piece about this is to recognize that the work with activists and organizers needs to be a combination of offerings that are group as well as individual. Now, interestingly enough, sometimes we assume that activists and organizers, because they are so communal, that they need a group space. That's not always the case. Sometimes they may need space that is just one-on-one so that they can have a private, individual experience where they can focus on themselves, still part of the collective, but to identify their personal needs. And quite honestly, because they may need a space to deal with some of the stigmas that are related to some of the common mental health challenges that are emerging in response to the trauma they experience while fighting against oppression. Finally, radically inclusive. Similar to what I said with the other slides, radically inclusive of all identities. This is not an either or kind of work. This is deep in the both and. Deep in the both and of gender, sexuality, ability, age, class, colorism, hair texture, geographical expectations. We have to understand that radical inclusivity means becoming curious when somebody does not step into one of the binaries that many of us have been classically trained to classify experience within. Non-monolithic spiritual support, group and individual spaces, and radically inclusive. I'm really thankful that recently I've been able to talk with healers who kind of sit in these different spaces. The first space that I want to introduce that does a great job around non-monolithic, not really even explicitly religious care work is the Track for Movements work that is headed up by Teresa Mateus and Zachary Moon. They initially started this work to just kind of create space for people who are chaplains, healers, people of faith who want to support the movement. They also have created within that, so there's an entire curriculum and a training related to that. And the training focuses on many of the areas that I addressed here. But also they do also have a model that they're developing called a front and back line of support. The front and back lines are great, I think, because they create an opportunity for people to get in spaces that they can be useful, and also that they can also be life affirming and healthy while they're providing support and care. So the frontline healers are ones who actually go into direct action spaces and provide live person-to-person support and care. The backline actually are those, they don't go out into the field, but their responsibility is to show up to support the frontline workers so that the frontline workers won't kind of spill onto each other as they work, as they're both shouldering what they're carrying while they're holding space for others. And it also creates an opportunity for them to just back up and be able to say, I know that I need to be able to talk about this one thing right here and right now. And so it's reinforced support. So support immediately for the movement, and then there's support for the healers. I think it's an amazing model. You can find out more information on them at trackformovements.org. The group and individual work, Matthew Williams and Ramal Toon have created a space that is specifically for male identified African Americans who are socially engaged in their work, involved in activism, organizing, and also in their community work. And they have created, the first time they created it was an actual retreat specifically for Black males to deal with and deconstruct ideas of masculinity that did not give them life and did not allow them to live fully into their humanity as male identified persons. What I love about what they've done is that they've also created a digital space, which was just as important for folks once we hit the pandemic. And I talked with them and I said, was it different? Did they lose anything? Did they felt like they didn't have as much? And they said, no, They came to this space ready to share and involve themselves in the work of healing collectively. But it's also important to recognize that they had gone from this retreat that was face to face over a year ago. They had maintained monthly check-ins, which I think is really important. A great model is that we hold spaces and then we check in with people, or create spaces where we hold the space, but they check in with one another, so that we kind of get away from this assumption that we hold the healing and that there's not as much opportunity for folks to work on healing collectively, which is really how resilience is built. And then additionally, the final person I want to talk about is Jade T. Perry. Jade T. Perry, also known through her work for Mystic Soul, also holds amazing, beautiful digital space for organizers across the country, where she's working on this concept called the Black Mystic. And this is a great example of non-monolithic, expansive, radically inclusive space that is being held for folks to, first of all, name what they're dealing with, but also to identify the legacy, the healing traditions that have been a part of Black radical resistance for a long time. Jade is bringing those resources, those books, those voices, those images, those sounds into the space so that people can learn strategies that help them resist and also heal, and also to ground them, understanding that their work comes from somewhere. This emancipatory and healing impulse has a grounding, and that they are stepping into a tide that is cross-generational, and they will become part of someone else's tide at a later time. And so I think that, again, the work of Track for Movements, the work of Matthew Williams and Ramal Toon, and also Jade T. Perry are amazing examples of these three things that I've identified as clearly important for clearing space: non-monolithic, group and individual, radically inclusive. And so I'm hoping that this has been an offering that demonstrates the ways in which the healing impulse is just as important as the emancipatory impulse, and that they run parallel to one another and have beautiful moments of intersection where they feed one another. So I do want to make it clear that healing is not just about the restoration of the freedom work, but freedom work is healing in and of itself. And I think that's a pretty important foundational concept for us all to get, especially when we are raised in a culture that says you should rest all the time and that someone else will take care of it, or it's not that big of a deal. To acknowledge that resistance work is a form of healing in and of itself. Our work, however, is to show up the healing component so that they can balance each other out, all for the wholeness and wellness of those who are committed to the work of radical liberation, emancipation, and quite honestly, the realization of love, life, and thriving. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you during this time. I look forward to reading and hearing about all of the different ways in which you all are stepping into the healing tide and doing the work of emancipation and love. Take care.